Hey, so welcome to the first day of Black Hat. Thanks for being here. The first day when you have no excuse to be hungover. Welcome to the threat intelligence track. We're going to start off with a talk about Max and Age and APT. So I'm hoping you guys are a lively crowd because our co-workers are speaking next door, and they've got all kinds of jokes in their deck. So if every once in a while you guys could laugh uproariously as if you're enjoying yourselves, we'd really appreciate it, okay? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So my name is Alex Stamos, co-founder and CTO of ISEC Partners. This is Paul Youn, who, if I mispronounce his name, I own bottle service, so I did okay, right? He's one of our senior security consultants. BJ Orvis, one of our security consultants at ISEC. And here, Tom and Aaron, stand up and wave, guys who are part of the research team, but there's no more seats up here, so sorry, guys. We're going to do a quick background of what APT means to us, since it is a term that has very little meaning anymore. So we're going to try to define what we're talking about when we talk about an APT attack and what that looks like technically. And then we're going to break it down into the components of what an attacker has to do successfully, what the attack tree looks like for an APT to be successful. And at each moment, we're going to talk about how does a MAC hold up in this. The reason we're doing this talk is that we've been part of incident response on a bunch of these APT attacks, and after them, we had some clients come to us and ask, what can we do to make things better? Like, in one of the example options was, maybe we should switch to Max, right? And a number of our clients have actually made that decision to switch to Max as their dominant platform or their future platform based upon the fact that these APT attacks targeted Windows technologies. And they asked us, what does that mean if we turn on all this Mac technology that we've never used before? What does that mean for our ability to withstand really advanced attackers? And we said, we don't know. And it turns out there's almost no open literature or research into these technologies, things like AFP, Apple Open Directory, Apple MDM, server admin. There's just nothing out there. And so we tried to go through and systematically look at OS 10. Now OS 10.7, we were able to update almost the entire deck based upon the line release a couple weeks ago, and see how it holds up at each of these steps. And at the end, we'll do a apples to apples comparison between OS 10 and Windows. And that will be the part that will cause a big flame war on Slashdot. So preface and background. So what is APT? First off, it's a term that every time I use it, Kevin Mandia gets a quarter, so I'm going to try not to use it too much. It means advanced persistent threat, and to us, the advanced part doesn't mean that every attack is advanced. It means that the attackers are willing to upgrade their capability as far as is necessary. So there have been a bunch of state-sponsored attacks that use Ghost-Rat and other off-the-shelf, crimeware tools to do the exploitation and create a control channel. But there have also been attacks where the defenders are much better prepared. They've got enterprise antivirus. They're monitoring machines. Their machines are hardened, where we see custom code being deployed. So advanced doesn't mean it's always advanced. It just means that these people have the ability to turn the knob up on the advanced scale. And generally, at the top end, that means that they're going to be using zero-day vulns, usually zero-day client-side vulns and zero-day local privilege escalation, as well as O-day malware, with control channels that are not going to show up in your IDS by default. Persistent means that these attackers don't just go in and get something and then leave. Persistence on the network is one of their goals. When you think of this as a possible state-sponsored thing, obviously, if I'm working for a state agency, having access to a major Fortune 500 company on an ongoing basis could be very useful, right? Maybe one of their competitors in my state goes and talks to the intelligence agency and says it would be helpful for us to have their financial projections next month, right? You don't want to go and start the whole process. It's much better if you can just say, oh, great, I already have an SSH tunnel for that, right? And you can go and do your work, and you have your external VPN tokens, you have your credentials. And so that's the persistent part. And threat means that, when you talk about APT, it's supposed to be actually the threat of, the actual attackers, a classification of attackers. When we're talking about it, we're going to talk about more of APT as a specific attack tree, as was seen during the Aurora attacks and some other subsequent ones. So we're going to kind of cheat on that one. Everybody here has heard of Aurora. Google disclosed it. I would say very bravely of them, disclosed that they were victims of this, and through some very hard work that they did to take over control machines and dynamic DNS names, they were able to discover evidence of 30 other companies being victimized, the vast majority of which had no idea that they were victims until they got a call from Google. There's dozens to hundreds of companies possibly were attacked, according to some later estimates, although that's a pretty fuzzy number. We were part of a lot of those conversations, and once the the public announcement went out about Aurora, there were a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, my virus scanner just found something. That means I'm part of Aurora," right? It's like, no, that means somebody was clicking the wrong links, right? That doesn't mean you're being attacked by the Chinese. We personally can't talk about the companies that are involved, but thanks to an email leak from another company, you can go read all about it. Not that I'd recommend you go download that, but there's a list of some of those companies that were involved. So a quick case study. This is a super generic network diagram where over here we have a remote overseas office. It's interesting to note that of the Aurora victims we were part of, the initial attack actually always happened in an overseas office to a Mandarin-speaking employee, possibly because if you want to attack somebody, socially engineer them, you're going to want to do it in your native language, right? If I tried to socially engineer somebody in my high school Spanish, I would guess that it wouldn't work out too well. So we have our remote network over here, and then we have our US-based corporate network, perhaps production plus the CorpNet, and a layer 3 WAN backbone, and local internet termination on the remote office. Why is it that often Chinese offices use local ISPs? Anybody know why? Or always use local ISPs? They have to, right? The Chinese government requires you to terminate your internet on the inside of their firewall, of the Great Firewall. You can't bring their internet back out like through your global router core because they don't want your employees reading about Tibet and such. So that means generally you have a very high-speed connection direct to China Telecom or another local provider inside of China. So the attack starts with a spear phishing attack. Often this is actually a very, very advanced spear phishing attack in that the attack is based around human intelligence that they've gathered about the victim, right? In some of these cases, actually, family members of the victims have been attacked, their machines taken over, and then a authenticated chat channel like MSN Chat or Yahoo Chat or a Facebook message or Baidu message was used to then communicate with the person on the inside of the corporate firewall, which is tough. I mean, that's a tough thing to beat, right? Like when my wife tells me, "Hey, Alex, do this thing on a chat channel," I don't Turing test her, right? Like, I have to assume that it's actually her, otherwise things could end poorly. And so that kind of spear phishing attack is actually very difficult, especially with social networks where you're able to build an understanding of the relationship between the victim that you're using to get in and the final victim. The attacker gets this person to click on a link. They use an ODay client-side exploit. They establish a control channel outbound. They now have control of a domain-joined machine. And here is where it gets kind of cute. Their goal is now to escalate their privilege on the local domain, to become domain admin, at least in that local domain. There's probably about a dozen ways you can do this. The most popular is NTLM relay attacks. You can also do NTLM downgrades and then offsite cracking. You can do Kerberos SPN attacks. You can use an ODay against a server port that's open internally, that's not open externally. Obviously, there's lots of ways to escalate from a low-rights user to domain admin. They become domain admin. They take over the domain controller. They steal the database of all the users in the domain. They go and crack that off-site. Obviously, in the vast majority of cases, that domain server database has landman hashes, which then fall immediately to a pre-computed dictionary hack. And they reestablish control. Either they'll come over the backbone WAN, or in a lot of cases, we see that these attackers like to issue themselves VPN access. So they might issue themselves certificates from the corporate PKI, which lets them get in through the L2TP tunnel. Or in at least one case, we saw them log into the RSA ACE server using the domain admin creds, and then issue themselves RSA smart tokens. This was before the RSA breach. Now they don't even have to do that, right? Anybody here from RSA? Good. If you're saying you're not, then we're going to use RSA as our example for everything. Excellent. Now that they're inside the corporate network and they have everybody's password, right? It doesn't matter how good your password is, it's going to fall against that kind of attack, against the master database and the domain controller. They're able to, instead of going and directly attacking production, what generally happens is they find the people that have access to the data they want, take over their machines, and then access production from that machine as would be normally happen during a workday, which is a really tough thing to catch. Even if you're watching your logs carefully, if the CFO accesses your financial information, that doesn't set off any alarms, right? And they will exfiltrate. Often they will build a drop server within their overseas office, exfiltrate a ton of data into it, and then all at once exfiltrate out the local firewall, making it very, very difficult that even if, say, you have a network forensics device here or an IDS that catches that they're uploading gigs of data, you don't have a lot of time. Yeah, that clock's not ticking. You don't have a lot of time to react to get that cut off. And if they do it in the middle of the night, when there's nobody on call that has the capability to cut off the internet to the Chinese office, then you're kind of toast. Cool. So let's talk about the first step here, social engineering.
Hello? Okay, for social engineering attack, the targets aren't going to be your most technical users. They're not going to be your senior engineers. They're probably going to be someone in marketing or accounting. And they're looking for a user who maybe doesn't have the strongest appreciation for security risks. So someone who's maybe more likely to click on a malicious link that was sent to them or open a file that was sent to them in email. So we're going to try to explore maybe how resistant to such an attack would your typical Mac user be. So a lot of things actually make a Mac user much safer than a Windows user. And for starters, Apple has a very small market share of personal computers. They have about 6 to 8%. That means not many people are interested in attacking Mac users. It's much more fruitful for me to take a well-known exploit, crime pack, spread it out as wide as I can, and even if I only can compromise unpatched machines, since I'm throwing it at so many users, that's still going to be quite a few people. Another ISEC consultant, Dan Guido, has done quite a bit of research into what makes a vulnerability likely to be turned into a crime pack and weaponized and widely distributed. And I encourage you to check out his research. But essentially, there are no crime packs that are very popular that target Mac OS X. That's starting to change, but for the large part, it's true. So when Macs have been targeted, it's typically been like a social engineering attack, like Mac Defender. So Mac users have been trained to feel safe for a very long time. There's a long history of not being exploited by attackers. It's much more common for binaries to be unsigned in OS X. So Mac users are getting used to clicking through running applications that aren't signed. Fewer Mac users are prone to run antivirus. This ESET study is referenced in a CNET article that shows only 20% of Mac users feel very vulnerable to cybercrime, as opposed to 52% of Windows users. Apple's marketing isn't really helping either. So Apple kind of perpetuates this feeling. So in this marketing slide, they say that OS X doesn't get PC viruses, which is kind of a tautology. I mean, my toaster oven also does not get PC viruses. But at the same time, OS X it's not impossible to get malware onto a Mac. If Stuxnet has taught us anything, any computer system can be infected with malware. So if you search Apple's forums for instances of the word virus, you get a lot of conversations like this. So here we have a user wondering, do I have a virus on my MacBook? And this helpful response from a level 4 Mac user says, if you do, you will make history. There are no viri that can affect OS X. None, nada, zero, zilch, zero values, binary 0, all bits off, which is a really long-winded way for him to let us know that he's a little bit crazy. But I think Mac Defender has really reminded us that malware can exist on OS X, and on top of that, that Mac users may be susceptible to social engineering. So Mac users may be safer, but that doesn't mean that the operating system is more secure. In 2008, 14.3% of all operating system vulnerabilities were reported against OS X, which is more than any other operating system. There's a comparable number of CVEs that are reported against Apple and Apple products as Windows and Windows products. So, I mean, there's slightly fewer, but it's pretty close. So there is safety in numbers. There aren't many Mac users, but that's very different from having a more secure operating system. So let's bring it back to APT. Remember, these targeted attacks, they don't care what operating systems you're running. They're after your resources. So the fact that typically your personal Mac user isn't being attacked that often doesn't have very much bearing on the APT. Mac users haven't felt vulnerable to attacks in the past, and that might make them more susceptible to social engineering. And as we've seen, there are plenty of vulnerabilities that could be weaponized and used to exploit Mac users if someone bothered to do it. So BJ is going to talk a little bit about how those exploits might take place.
OK. So once you have an initial interaction with your targeted user, you want to basically get a payload onto their system and try to exploit something, either the user or a piece of code that your payload is interacting with. I mean, very frequently, you have the web browser and several plugins, which have a long history of vulnerabilities. But you could also use a social engineering attack to try to convince the user to install your software on their system. So for example, you have Safari's safe files, which Mac Defender utilized in order to trick users into installing it. essentially, it was a drive-by download. The users they had to have the save files checkbox checked, and Safari would automatically unzip the download and automatically run installer.app, which would then open the package file that would install Mac Defender. At that point, the user would have to click through the installer and actually let the installer run normally. Basically, the point here is that Mac Defender and its variants triggered 4 to 5 times higher than the normal call volume at AppleCare. So while they fell for the initial exploit, they were aware that something odd was going on, but there's no reason why you couldn't write an exploit that once it installs, it just wouldn't do anything obvious to the user. So Apple has some attempts at mitigating drive-by downloads and determining what files are considered safe. When a web browser downloads a file, both Safari, Firefox, and the other browsers all basically mark a file as being in the file quarantine, which is a part of Apple's Launch Services API. It was first introduced in macOS 10.5, and essentially it allows the Finder and other launch service-based programs to, when the user double-clicks on the file, it pops up with a warning dialog and says, you download this file from the internet. Are you sure you want to run this or open this? And basically, the file quarantine determines what files are considered safe and where they need to warn you versus where it's assumed just safe and it'll automatically just let you open the file without prompting the user. Also, then in 10.6, Apple added a signature-based malware detection feature that has a file called xprotect.plist that was used to, which basically contains some signatures in order to try and detect malware. When it first was released, there were only like 2 or 3 signatures. But then in March of this year, Apple updated the xprotect to basically perform daily checks to see if there are any new signatures. And as of this morning, there were 17 signatures in my xprotect database. So let's take a look at how, if you wanted to do an automated exploit against the browser, against a plugin. Apple has several mitigations in place now on more recent versions of their operating system, although they have in general lagged behind both Microsoft Windows and Linux in terms of when they have implemented their mitigations. So, like, as you can see, like, Apple didn't really start incorporating stack smashing protections until 2007, and some of their other features, while they were introduced like in 2006 or 07, they haven't really been matured until Snow Leopard or Lion. So for stack smashing, Apple uses both their own LLVM compiler as well as GCC for developers to compile their code. And both of them use ProPolice, which is essentially add stack smashing protection whenever it sees a function that contains a buffer in it. Apple also uses -d fortify source in 10.6, which can allow, basically the compiler will see using like unsafe string functions and will attempt to harden them further, their use of them further. One of the big challenges is in 10.5 was when GCC 4.2 was first included, which has ProPolice, but GCC 4 was the default, so the stack protector was not available by default. And in 10.6, it finally switched over to being there for binaries that were enabled. One of the bigger problems, though, is that if you build your binary on an older tool chain, then you won't have the stack smashing protections. With heap protections, Apple has not done a whole lot. In 10.6, they finally added a security cookie to the heaps metadata. So basically, they take a check some of the metadata and include a security cookie in that, so that they can detect whether or not the heap metadata was tampered with by, say, a heap buffer overflow on the heap. Microsoft Windows has had similar protection since 2003, and also Windows has suffered from other forms of heap-based attacks. So they've included numerous additional heap protections, and we're unaware of any other protections that Apple's provided yet. You then have the basically an NX-bit on Intel are also called basically DEP, data execution prevention, where you want to not disallow code from executing in the data part of your program. It's been supported on Intel architecture since 10.4, but Apple hasn't really implemented stronger support for it until essentially 10.7, where it finally has full coverage. As you can see, 32-bit support was still somewhat limited in 10.6, and it's improtect based, which is a function call that allows you to specify the permissions for a given page of memory. But even on 10.6, 32-bit code cannot, if you tell it to explicitly enable the execution protection, it would not disable the executability of that page of code. Finally, we have ASLR, address space layout randomization. Apple first introduced it in 10.5, but it's based on Apple's pre-binding, which is a performance optimization in libraries where it automatically pre-computes where in memory the library will be loaded. And so basically, it creates a per-machine randomization. Also, even through 10.6, Apple does not randomize everything. So like DYL, the dynamic link loader is not randomized. And Charlie Miller, in a update to the Mac Hackers Handbook presentation he made, points out that there are return-oriented programming exploits that can be used with the dynamic linker. Unfortunately, though, in 10.7, Apple says that they've significantly improved their ASLR implementation to a point that's supposed to be comparable to Windows. One major drawback, though, both with ASLR and their depth features, is it's not configurable. Basically, the problem is that if you compile your code, link your code on 10.6, and then run on 10.7, at least your depth will not be there. So basically, coming back to APT, Apple's been behind Microsoft, but they're finally starting to catch up in terms of exploit mitigation. Their dep and their ASLR are not configurable, so you can't necessarily apply them to all older code. And they still have some, which leads to these backwards compatibility threats.
So once you've gotten onto a machine, what are some of the things that you can do? And I'm going to talk a little bit about local privilege escalation. This isn't exhaustive by any means, but just a few ideas of what an attacker might do. So of course, once you've compromised a machine, just like in Windows, you have access to that user's information. And that can include valuable things like email, browser history. Maybe if they're a developer, it might have some source code. So there's quite a bit that's immediately available. There's one particular file that might be of interest to an attacker, which is the login keychain. And the login keychain is kind of unique to OS X. There isn't really a common credential store in Windows that is comparable to the login keychain. The login keychain uses a salted version of your password and 1,000 rounds of hash to generate an encryption key to protect secrets in the login keychain. And although the hash is strong, remember that these attackers are quite advanced. So they could run a brute force attack against the login keychain offsite on like 1,000, 10,000 cores and have pretty reasonable chance of getting that password. And of course, users pick kind of bad passwords typically. So that attack might be very successful. So once I've had that user's password, if that low privilege user happens to be a sudoer, that's direct privilege escalation. Obviously, you can just sudo and run privilege commands. Even if they're not a high privilege user, you can decrypt the contents of that login keychain. Apple loves putting things into the login keychain by default. Like one example is if you create an encrypted volume in OS X, by default that encryption key is stored into your login keychain. So if I decrypt that login keychain, I'm going to have access to potentially network credentials, all kinds of credentials that might help me explore the rest of this corporation's network. So how else might I escalate privilege? Well, OS X has a pop-up that frequently will ask for privilege escalation. So this example on the screen is the software update privilege escalation pop-up. So Windows does something similar. It has a user interface privilege isolation screen, but that screen is probably harder to see. So this is that screen that pops up and takes control of everything. So in Windows, they use something called alpha blending, which kind of displays the rest of your desktop, but it's a bit grayed out. So that action is something that requires privilege in Windows. Only privileged users can take a screenshot and perform that action. So in theory, that would be much harder to fake. But Apple can't do that, because in Apple, on OS X, applications have transparency built in. So if they try to do something similar, there isn't a way to prevent another application from doing that as well. So take a quick look. So this is the actual software update. And this is a similar application with a slight difference. So instead of performing a software update, this application will just send your credentials to our web server in an HTTP GET. Again, UAC might be spoofable in Windows as well, but in Apple, they do make it pretty easy. So Apple has made quite a few improvements in 10.7, and we should mention them. So they've introduced several strong security features that would help prevent against local privilege escalation. So many of these features are based on techniques that were developed for iOS to sandbox applications and processes. And the application sandbox is one of those. Previously, an application would run with the privileges of the executing user. But now with the app sandbox, data is handled in a per application container. Entitlements for applications have to be requested. They can be fine-grained and per session. So depending on which user is executing the application and what the user needs to do, those can change. And to break out of the sandbox, they have some tools like PowerBox, which is on sandbox that is integrated with various pieces of UI, so like NSOpenPanel and NSSavePanel. So this is a list of some of the fine-grained controls that an application can request. So these entitlements include things to access network assets, personal information, and other portions of the file system. And temporary exceptions can also be granted for even higher privilege actions. Apple's also rolling out a more secure way to manage inter-process communication called XPC. And XPC will allow applications to sandbox dangerous functionality into low-privilege processes with separate address spaces. So the XPC service itself can't be escalated to root. And an example of what a use of XPC is QuickTime. So QuickTime Player puts a decoder service into a separate low-privilege process. So this decoder process is going to handle a lot of dangerous files, like movie files, which are a strong avenue for attack against QuickTime. These are completely under control of a potential attacker. But now if something goes wrong, even if that process is compromised, it's still running in a jail. It's still running as low privilege. So the functionality is also nice, by segregating out these helper processes. If that helper process crashes, it doesn't bring down the entire application. So Apple has worked very hard to make XPC and application sandboxing very easy for application developers to use. And we look forward to 10.7 when all applications will hopefully use these technologies. So let's bring it back to APT. So again, once you've compromised a local account, obviously the local data on that machine can be accessed. Credentials can be brute forced. And even in 10.7, the login keychain is accessible to sandbox applications for usability reasons. So although 10.7 has made a lot of strides forward, there's still quite a bit of attack surface. OS 10 has kind of weak UI controls, so privilege escalation screens will still be easier to spoof in Apple until they come up with something more secure, a way to warn the user that this cannot be spoofed. But again, kudos to Apple for making a lot of improvements in 10.7. So I'm going to pass it back to BJ, who's going to talk a little bit about network privilege escalation.
Okay. So once you've compromised one computer in an organization's network, you have this initial foothold, and you want to start spreading throughout the rest of the network. You want to try to compromise administrator accounts as well as the directory server in order to allow you to essentially acquire whatever information you actually want to access. Most of the section we'll be talking a little bit about what Tom and Aaron presented at Source Seattle in May and also at TourCon. What we did previously was we examined the network administration protocols that were used in Snow Leopard server and also to manage basically enterprise Mac networks. And we've realized that there were pervasive authentication issues. Not only were a lot of the protocols frequently unencrypted, but they did not provide a strong way of authenticating the server that you're communicating with, or there were other forms like downgrade attacks against the authentication. And basically using these issues, we found a way to use two of the protocols in order to exploit them on the network. But first, let's still talk about Apple's file sharing protocol. Essentially, it uses something called user authentication modules to authenticate the user. Historically, it's allowed weaker modules like no user authentication, which basically is a setup where the user does not need to authenticate at all. They can access anything on the server. Or the clear text password, which was disabled in the client side in macOS 10.2. But there's still these other authentication mechanisms which do have various potential attacks against them, such as the two-way random and the random number exchange, which both can have problems where they're using DES, which is a relatively weak cryptographic protocol. And or Diffie-Hellman, which basically can be exploited by an active network attacker by performing a man in the middle. One of the big problems, though, is that an active network attacker could ask the client to use a weaker authentication mechanism than the normal server would actually require the client to use. And because the client doesn't know better, they will then use this weaker protocol, and then the attacker gets, say, the DES data, and they can then pull it off site to crack it. And then we also looked at Apple Remote Desktop and Bonjour, which Apple Remote Desktop is basically Apple's version of Remote Desktop. It's based off of VNC, and they use a Diffie-Hellman-based authentication mechanism in order to create a shared key between the server and the client. And the client then sends their authentication credentials over this encrypted channel. The problem here, obviously, is that Diffie-Hellman is essentially used anonymously, and the client doesn't do anything to guarantee that the server they're communicating with is the same server they've communicated with previously, or any form of other identification. Additionally, it uses Bonjour to find out the name of the service in question, of the computer that you're connecting to. And Bonjour provides no form of authenticating the server. It just provides this IP address has this computer name. And it has problems in the RFC that explicitly state that that peers have to back off of their desired name if someone else takes it. So if I say I am Paul, and Paul sees this, he goes, oh no, I can't be Paul now. I need to be Paul too. And that way now I can start pretending to be Paul to other computers on the network. So we created a proof of concept of using these two protocols to show one potential attack that we called Bonjour. Normally, you have here a computer named file server, and it's telling the network that it's running Apple Remote Desktop. When the administrator's client computer sees the server, it goes, "Oh, you're running a remote desktop. I know I can connect to you." And in the morning, the administrator logs into their computer. They log into the file server once. And throughout the day, Remote Desktop will start gathering data will log into the server and basically pull statistical information down from it. And at this point, it doesn't require any user interaction from the administrative user. So suppose an attacker injects himself into the network. He basically tells everyone to flush their Bonjour DNS cache, and he then says, "My name is file server." The real file server goes, "Wait a moment, someone else has my name now. I better change my name." And this leads to the problem of where the attacker now is the file server. The real file server now says its name is file server 2. And when the administrator automatically tries to connect a file server to gather statistical information about the running of the system, it sends the username and credentials to the attacker just automatically. The attacker then can grab these credentials and use it to pass the connection on to the actual file server, and then basically transparently allow the normal communication to run. The attacker then can log into the file server 2, and basically tell it, "You need to change your name back to file server." And then it tells everyone on the network to flush your DNS cache again. And the original file server now goes, "Okay, my name is file server. I'm running Apple Remote Desktop." Later, the administrator comes back to his computer, and everything seems to be running perfectly fine because he is talking back directly to the actual file server. So here's some sample output from our program. It basically just shows that we have our Bonjour server running. It receives a connection from a remote desktop, performs the standard authentication with Diffie-Hellman, getting an AS shared key, and then it sees the credentials from the administrator. And a big point here is that no user interaction was necessary for this attack to work. So several of Apple's problems with Apple's network protocols include there's no standardized authentication mechanism or configuration. In Windows, they essentially have a way where all their major administrative protocols can use a standard framework for doing authentication to use NTLM v2 or whatever. And basically all of Apple's major administrative protocols suffer from some form of authentication weakness. Furthermore, Bonjour makes it really easy to do DNS poisoning locally, and the lack of authentication of the servers basically allows the attacker to steal credentials. So I'm going to pass it back to Alex.
Hey, so this is the first time either one of these guys has been on a stage this size. So can I hear a round of applause for these guys? Because this is pretty intimidating. It's just a lot of smart people in the audience. Okay, so we're going to move on. These are going to be a little faster because these are a little less Apple specific, and then we'll do our little apples and apples comparison. So when you want to persist on the machine, it turns out there's lots of different ways you can persist on any of these operating systems, both legitimate ways like the creation of a startup item, the creation, modifying of startup scripts, the creation of new services, and also of modification of the underlying operating system in ways that aren't automatically caught. It also turns out there's some fun things in Apple. Specifically, they have the capability to do things like to attach AppleScript events to folders themselves. So you can theoretically build a user mode rootkit out of only AppleScript without writing any C code or running a service or doing any hooking, which is a lot of fun. At the network layer, once our attacker has done all this work, they've now escalated their privilege up. They want to be able to re-access the network whenever they want. Generally, like I've talked about before, so they like to issue themselves VPN credentials, which is a situation like that. Doing that on an Apple machine that's hosting IPsec or L2TP is obviously not a problem once you're an admin, or they go things like issue their own soft tokens and certificates. It turns out there's a long history of good research into userland rootkits on the Mac. And I just want to make a point here, because this is often lost on a Black Hat audience. There's a lot of talks here at Black Hat about the race to ring zero, right? Of people going out and saying, oh, I wrote a better rootkit that you can't detect. And then somebody else saying, that person's stupid, I can actually detect it, and my rootkit's better. It turns out that nobody in the real world actually does any of that stuff, right? You never see blue pills, you never see people using hypervisor rootkits. You rarely see real state-sponsored attackers even going into the kernel. And it's because user mode rootkits have two benefits. One, they're easy to write, and two, they have fewer compatibility problems, right? Anybody here ever written kernel driver code? Yeah, it's a pain in the ass, right? And a big part of that is actually the QA portion. If you want to write a Windows driver, the number of different versions of Windows you have to QA it on to make sure you don't blue screen the box is pretty significant, right? Writing a user mode service is much faster, easier, and much less likely to create crashes that are going to indicate that you're attacking. And so I would expect that just like in the Windows world, when we see real APT attacks against Mac, we're going to see pretty reasonable user mode rootkits that do things like just name themselves like services that you normally see, right? And most likely will not get caught. So from a defender's perspective, what do we do from an incident response perspective when we're defending a Mac? There are commercial products that will each eat up HFS Plus, which is the standard very aged Mac file system based upon FFS from the Berkeley system days. Hopefully something that gets updated soon. There are a bunch of things that will eat it. Ncase is kind of the commercial standard, also something I said lots of bad things about a couple of years ago, so I'll remind you of that. Blacklight is actually a Mac-based forensics product made by Black Bag Technologies. That's actually quite a good product, at least when you run it on Macs, FTK. They all do reasonably good disk forensics. The real problem is that disk forensics is not how you fight APT anymore, right? If you're going in and you say, oh, this machine's talking over it's doing funny DNS requests to a server in China, and so we're going to pull this machine and we're going to image the hard drive forensically, and now we're going to examine it and we're going to look for all kinds of bad things. That's an 18-hour process, right? That is not fast enough to deal with these kinds of attacks. You do not have that window of time because that's a lot of time for them to say, oh, that machine dropped off. I'm going to go change my tactics, or I'm going to remove my malware, or I'm reading their email and I see that they hired a forensics guy, right? In-memory forensics, especially in-memory forensics that you can do remotely, is kind of the key thing, and it's something that there's been a lot of product development over the last couple of years for Windows. Mandiant has their own proprietary product that they use with their services. HB Gary sells Active Defender and Responder and a bunch of stuff that eats Windows. There's no real good equivalent on Mac right now. There are some people looking into it. There are people working on this from an open source perspective, and I can't announce anything because it's not my product, but hopefully they're going to be releasing something later. There's also no good way to check the integrity of a Mac operating system while it's dead. One of the funny things about OS X is when you install it, depending on the exact dot release of the hardware, it lays down different drivers and different EFI bootloader, right? None of which are signed. So unless you have the money to go out and buy every dot release of every Apple product, which the Apple guys up here would totally love if you do that for their stock price, unless you have that kind of money to go do that and then manually go rehash every time, there's no good hash set that you can use to check. And we've dealt with this. We've had clients bring us Macs where we have to go and do tons of manual verification where we go out and find the exact same model of product so we can clear a checkbox to make sure that that kernel driver is correct. So definitely not a lot of good options for instant response in the Mac right now. The other kind of fear is that there's a lot of state on any modern computer, but especially Macs, right? Apple loves to lean forward on hardware changes. I wouldn't say they embrace and extend, but they do love to sell you $50 Thunderbolt cables. And so you find a lot of, mostly these days, Intel-based technologies, but things like they use the EFI bootloader, which they were the first major PC manufacturer to use EFI, which is terrifying, right? I mean, people could always backdoor your BIOS in the history, but they would have had to say, oh, you're using this specific HP, so we're going to write this specific HP Phoenix BIOS rootkit. And now EFI creates a general 64-bit executable sandbox in which you can write pretty much generic malware that may be able to persist on the vast majority of different machines. EFI is terrifying. Macs also have all of these fun things like the system management controller that are Apple-specific hardware that you can update from user mode inside the OS 10, right? And Thunderbolt, not only is Thunderbolt probably going to be good for doing hot boot memory forensics like the FireWire DMA attack, although nobody's proven it yet. But it has its own firmware set, and they've already released, even though Thunderbolt's only been out for a couple months, they've already released patches for Thunderbolt in the firmware. So this is a real problem because honestly, the vast majority of defenders in the world do not have the capability to look into these devices and certainly don't have the ability to analyze what they get out of them. And this is a conversation we've had with Apple and with some of the major hardware manufacturers where I think, if you are a hardware manufacturer, an OEM, this is a conversation we'd like to have with you because this is a capability that needs to be built into the public sphere that you don't have to be the NSA with a lab where you can pull apart and pop an EFI chip into a EEPROM reader or something. And, you don't want to have that capability to do standard forensics. Like I said, we've never seen this kind of stuff, but this is the direction these attacks are going to go from a persistence perspective. Exploration, our attackers are going to want to go through the Open Directory. We're assuming that they've escalated privilege. They're an admin on the network. They can now use LDAP search the Open Directory network, figure out who people are, what groups they're in. By default, when you do this, actually, it's very common in these kind of enterprise Mac environments for people to have AFP-mounted home directories on filers. That's obviously a fantastic way to then go and explore people's home directories without going from machine to machine. Obviously, if you're a root user on Open Directory server, just like if you're an admin on a domain controller, you're going to be able to pull out the real LDAP credential store and do an offline brute force attack. These are salted SHA, so brute force, pre-computed brute force attacks aren't as effective. You don't have the LAN manager problem, so it definitely is not trivial to go and crack 10,000 users. But out of a 10,000 user Open Directory database, I'm sure you can get a several thousand who will give you plenty of access. So some goals for defenders is to try to make sure that the server admins are never using root or don't have local admin on the box, and to make sure you're using like the strong passwords and such. And then exfiltration, like I talked about, generally the way we see this is an internal drop server is built that attackers, good advanced attackers, when they see something they want, they don't instantly take it, right? They're able to resist that temptation. They go and they put it in a drop server because they know that if they're careful about their exfiltration, they're much less likely to get caught. And remember, for the persistent part, these attackers are not smash and grab folks. They're not the kind of people that want to leave examples of SQL injection in your Apache logs. They're the kind of people that want to be able to come back and use all the work they've done to do more work in the future. So getting away with it is a big part of their exfiltration strategy, unlike, say, if you're a hacktivist or an e-criminal or something like that. So there's a lot of good covert channels here. Still, traditionally, the thing to look for in APT is to look for dynamic DNS names. I would strongly suggest you log all of your DNS requests across your enterprise, which sounds crazy, but it's actually not that crazy. They compress really nicely. You funnel all those DNS requests into a nice Splunk server, and then you build yourself a little Splunk template where it shows the top 10 dynamic DNS names that people are requesting. And you'll see some guys doing home IP for their server, and people who are bouncing their ESPN streams off their what's that box, Roku or whatever. People who are doing that kind of stuff. But if you see 40 different machines doing hundreds and hundreds of requests to a DNS name, that is something that needs to be investigated, because almost certainly that's going to be a dynamic DNS control channel for an APT attack. By far the best network monitoring you can do, which nobody will tell you because there's no product to sell you, right? But turn on logging of your DNS requests. The downside is you have to do that on the local DNS resolver. You can't do it up the hierarchy because you lose the context of the initial request. And then when you do that, make sure to cache the response, to log the response, because often those responses will have control information in them that'll be wiped out later in the attack. So things you need to think about when mitigating this stuff: coordinate your egress restrictions. Make sure if you have an overseas office that the same kind of network forensic stuff is put in place. Make sure you have real log monitoring, and you have to have people who are able to do this stuff 24/7. We dealt with an attack where we called him the Grinch because all of the exfiltration happened on Christmas Eve. And because they knew that nobody would be watching their logs. And when they came back on January 2nd, it was obviously 7 days too late. From a long-term perspective, outside of the Mac, big enterprises who care about playing at the state-sponsored level need to really rethink their global architectures. Lots of people get lease lines overseas to their other office, and they don't think about what that means. Like when you call up AT&T and you say, we want a lease line into Shanghai, do you think AT&T goes and digs a ditch and lays a fiber optic cable in China? How do they do it? Yeah, they call up the local telco, and they have an MPLS peering agreement with them, and they turn up an MPLS tunnel that terminates, that they buy on overseas cable and then terminates somewhere locally, and now is traveling through China Telecom or Etisalat or some other state-owned telecom company. That data is not encrypted. All there is there's a little tag on the front of that layer 2.5 protocol saying this belongs to this company. Everything's in plain text. Anybody here ever work as like a router engineer at a telco? There's got to be somebody, yeah. You can see a lot of crap, right? Like if you go and you look in a span port, there's an amazing amount of backbone traffic inside of massive Fortune 500 corporate networks that goes completely unencrypted under the ocean and through countries that you maybe don't trust. And so that's the kind of thing you got to think about that's outside of Macs, is who are you trusting to transit the kind of traffic, and what can they do if they have the ability to inject traffic in there? Can they take over arbitrary IP addresses? Can they inject OSPF routes and take over different parts of your network? Think about that. Okay, so that's the conclusion, the comparison. Here's our copyright violation of the day. We threw this in, so just in case the Apple lawyers called, we'd give them an easy win, right? In each phase of this APT, how does OS X stack up? And obviously our basis of comparison here, since we don't have an SI unit of security, our basis of comparison is going to be Windows. And for our comparison here, we're going to say, this is if a client came to us and said, hey, Alex, I want to rebuild my network from scratch. And they said on Windows, and I want to rebuild the Mac network. What's the best you can do? So totally patched the newest versions of these operating systems and hardened as much as reasonably possible without like modifying the OS or hooking into stuff, right? So what happens here? So on the initial exploitation perspective, this is where OS X has really caught up over the last couple of years. They've put a huge amount of work into making writing exploits hard for an obvious reason that this is one of the only parts of APT that actually also affects normal home users. And so if you're a consumer-based product company and you're thinking about security, then if you want to secure your consumers, this is where you want to focus on. We have a question mark because there hasn't really been any good open research into the heap. I'm sure there's lots of research in interesting languages on SVN servers places, but there's nothing open research in English that we could find on the current heap hardening stuff that's gone into 10.7. So I think this is going to be kind of a proof is in the pudding. We'll see how easy heap exploits are written for 10.7 over the next couple of months. But for the most part, we've pretty much OS X's pulled even, or in some cases is slightly better than Windows. The one problem here, though, is that OS X makes these decisions on what security anti-exploit technologies are used on compile and link time, right? So to get all of the benefits of OS 10.7 security, you have to have the software compiled on 10.7 with the latest Xcode, right? So we're really, as consumers, not going to see all the benefits of these things until all of the ISVs go out and rebuild their software on top of 10.7, which is a downside. On Windows, you have the ability to set either through GPO or a tool called emit to set rules of you are going to use anti-exploit technologies. And if you take an NT4 binary and run it on Windows 2008 R2 and all that stuff's turned on, it's going to crash. But at least it's crashing securely, right? Nobody's going to be able to exploit it. And so, as an administrator on Windows, you have the ability to say, don't let anybody do something stupid, and if they do something stupid, kill them, right? Whereas on a Mac, that's on a binary for binary basis. From a local privilege escalation perspective, OS X's done a lot of great work on their sandbox. It's some technology they backported from iOS. And I think actually this is where they're going to start to show a lot of benefit over Windows in the long term. The problem on the Windows side is, while it's totally possible to isolate your privileges, your processes, right? So you can call create process, and when you call create process, you can give it an NT security token, and you can use privilege masking on that token to make sure that that lower process can't do anything, right? This has been doable since NT4. There's no magic to it. But the problem is Microsoft doesn't really make it easy. It turns out that dropping privileges is not the hard part of writing an isolated sandboxed application. It's getting that application to do the stuff that the user wants it to do while inside the sandbox. And to do that, you have to create a broker process, and you have to have a secure way of talking to it. So often we see people will come up with their own kind of RPC mechanism and their own serialization and marshalling mechanism, and then they run that over like a named pipe, because you can't use COM in that situation for some interesting reasons. But doing that is tough. And so if you're Google, and you're writing Chrome, you can go buy Green Border Technologies and roll those guys into your development process and build that. And if you're Adobe, and Acrobat and security is absolutely the thing that is critical to the future of the Acrobat line, you can pay the money necessary to hire those people to do that work. But the vast majority of Windows ISVs are never going to do that, right? They don't have the motivation, nor do they have the skill set to do that kind of really low-level Windows programming. Whereas on OS X, they've made it really easy. By default, you make an Xcode project, it's in the sandbox. Most of the stuff you want to do, accessing the network, accessing files in the home directory, they've already created brokers for that, or abilities to request those privileges in a way that you don't have to write a bunch of complicated code. And by default now, if you get an app out of the Mac App Store, it has to run in a sandbox. So I think we're definitely seeing, this technology could become very Orwellian. This is the way that one day, Steve Jobs could announce that you're not allowed to run arbitrary software in OS X, which would not be a good day. But certainly, hopefully, it's only used for good, and we'll end up with more and more sandboxing. That being said, local privilege escalation on both platforms is still pretty doable for most attackers. And on Mac, the logging keychain is definitely a problem. Windows doesn't have this problem. If you're running in low IL as a normal user, there's nothing you can grab off the machine that you can do an offline brute force attack to recreate either the NTLM hash or the original password. Then you have this thing called DPAPI, but it intermixes a bunch of entropy from other parts of the system so that you can't do that kind of brute force. And hopefully Apple fixes that in the future. How are we doing time-wise? Got a couple minutes.
52.
Network privilege escalation, this is where it gets really bad on the Apple side. This is also, I think, the heart of APT. When people come to us and say, how do I defend myself against a state-sponsored attacker, a really good attacker, we say you actually have to ignore the first couple steps here, because in any organization of reasonable size, let's say over 50 people, there's going to be somebody dumb enough to be socially engineered into just installing software. Right? You don't need to, and most people get malware because they intentionally install it, because it gives them pretty kittens that sit in the bottom corner, it changes their cursor, or they like the screensaver, right? And so at an organization, at a company of thousands of employees, you have to assume that one of them is going to get tricked to install malware, and that there'll have to be no exploitation, no local privilege escalation, yada yada. It's just done, right? And so this is where you have to start. Making sure that from, Bob the assistant, you cannot become Sally the domain admin, right? And that's the step that you can monitor. It's a step you can harden. But unfortunately on Macs, it's also the step that's pretty much trivial for attackers. And the real problem here is while, as BJ showed you that chart, every password-based authentication mechanism in OS X has problems, but certainly the Diffie-Hellman, unsigned Diffie-Hellman is a total goldmine for attackers, especially because pretty much every protocol in OS X server can be downgraded silently to Diffie-Hellman, or Diffie-Hellman extended, which provides no real security benefit. So that's it. That's the game. And there's no way to turn that off. There's no way to say, there's no equivalent of curb only, there's no little drop-down box that's the equivalent of NTLM v2 only, right? Game over. All of those things are downgradable. And we've always had man-in-the-middle attacks. We've got ARP spoofing, we've got DHCP spoofing, we've got DNS poisoning attacks. But the great thing on Apple networks is with MDNS, it's very, very easy and simple. You don't even have to be root locally to do it. And there are situations in which those attacks could actually be routed across the layer 3 router, so you don't have to be link local. The other great part is if you have link local IDS installed, I guarantee they are not keeping a state table of the correct bonjour addresses, right? That's not something that the $10,000 link local IDS sensor is spending any time on. So an MDNS attack almost certainly will go under the radar. And maybe this wasn't clear, but these things happen automatically. An AFP mount happens automatically. You do the poisoning, it renegotiates, you get the password, and then you go back and you say, fine. And nobody notices. With Apple Remote Desktop, if you have Apple Remote Desktop open to any of the machines you administer, it's automatically connected to all the other ones, right? Same with server admin. And so this is something that is just basically, I wouldn't say trivial, but it's just like 2 notches above trivial to escalate your privilege to become an admin on most managed Apple networks. Persistence, again, there's a lot of way to persist on both of these. The one benefit Windows has is there's a much greater ecosystem of technologies used for detecting and fighting persistence. That being said, hopefully, as people deploy Macs in enterprises, there's enough of a pull here that people will go build these products. If you're a venture capitalist, I've got some ideas. Come grab me later. And from an exploration and exfiltration, again, pretty much the same. The only difference here is, Windows has the ability to centrally set up outbound firewall rules so that you can make it difficult for things to talk off the box unless they're in the kernel. That being said, I've never actually seen that deployed in an enterprise. But in theory, you could do that. The other benefit you get on Windows is that they've really locked down what you can do as an unauthenticated user making an LDAP query against an Active Directory server, which LDAP on Open Directory is still a lot more open. That being said, in an APT attack, we're not really that concerned because we're kind of assuming that the bad guys are authenticated as a user already, and so that they're able to make these simple queries. So things that Apple can do. One of the basic thing here is that Apple's made a decision that's very different than Microsoft. Microsoft kind of likes to define protocols and make them the centerpiece of everything, right? So they decided RPC and then DC RPC and then DCOM, that stack of technologies is the center way that everybody at Microsoft will have to go through to administer machines. There are a couple of exceptions like SMB and RDP, but for the most part, if you open up like the Windows, the computer management box, and you add do MMC/A and you add a bunch of snap-ins, that's using the DC RPC ports and going over DCOM. And the benefit there is that Microsoft has the ability to now put all of that traffic through one choke point in the operating system and to provide security in one place. So their core, Windows security team can spend all this time making sure that the serialization is good and the security is good and that the authentication is good, and then providing centralized ways to configure that, and then you automatically get the benefit everywhere. Apple does the more Unixy thing where every service runs its own daemon. It makes a socket call and opens up a listening port, and then has to take care of its own security, right? And that's been a real problem here. It's because obviously when you look, we pulled a for brevity, we pulled a chart of all of the different protocols. But you look and there's a very different, every protocol has a different kind of starting point and ending point of how it does authentication and how it does integrity and confidentiality protection. And even on protocols where they're doing it correctly for authentication, there's almost no channel binding, right? They don't take a cryptographic key that comes out of the authentication and then integrity protect the channel, which gives you the ability just to relay the authentication and then modify what happens underneath it, right? So that's something Apple could look at is consolidating stuff. There's got to be a way to turn Bonjour off. It will never be secure. I mean, I get my DNS by listening to broadcast UDP packets, right? There's like nothing you can do about that. Invest in some way that they can centralize management so that when they make these security decisions, people can upgrade them. I showed an Apple engineer, the suggestion, and he had never seen group policy before, so I opened up our group policy editor on our domain controller, and he said, if I took that screenshot to Steve Jobs in a product review, he would fire me, rehire me, then so he could fire me again, right? Because it's like the ugliest, least intuitive interface designed by mankind, right? Which is true. But there are some options here for Apple to come up with the cute, fuzzy, alpha-blended, glowing interface to also allow people to securely manage boxes. So should you use Macs? Well, as you can see, we use Macs in our enterprise, but we treat them, and how I'd recommend you treat them, as little islands on your network, right? They're pretty good for remote exploitation. That's where Apple's put all this research and development into making them hard to exploit, and the sandbox work has been very good. But once you turn on any of the administrative stuff, once you basically install OS X Server, you're toast. There's pretty much nothing you can use OS X Server for securely, is what the outcome is. So I'd strongly recommend, if you're going to have things that people need to be administered centrally for, is you give people Macs, you let them use it for most of their stuff, and then give them, install VirtualBox, give them a Windows 7 64-bit domain-joined virtual machine in there, and then let that do all of its stuff and kind of create an overlay network. You could use IPsec. You domain join that, it can be BitLockered, and you create kind of two networks there, one that's managed and one isn't. But if you are managing these things centrally, then you're kind of toast. As we showed, we have a tool that in any reasonably managed Apple environment, if we ran it for 10 minutes, we'd have tons and tons of passwords, and nobody would catch us. We're not releasing it because there's nothing good you could do with it. But it's not it's the kind of thing people can recreate pretty quickly. So people who are in the back, I guess we got a little confused about whether we're ending early or not. So do we have time for questions? No. Okay, we're going to call it there. We'll be around for questions. Thanks for coming.